Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we're talking about protest waves as a special topic in the discussion of the nexus between political communication and political behavior. Now, political behavior research is really all about understanding how people actually behave, how they act in a political sense in their real world. And so these acts of political behavior can be, anything from voting to talking to a friend about politics, all the way up to running for office and participating in protest waves. And today is sort of again a special topic in this category of political behaviors. I want to think about protest as a theory, and use that maybe to talk a bit about the kind of big so what questions that we've been contending with throughout the course. And I guess first, just to review a little bit, I want to go back to a piece by Stekelenburg and Clandermans, which I think really helps us to understand sort of what protest waves are and sort of why they exist in the first place. These authors go through a few different theories that we've collected as political scientists over time in understanding why protest waves do and do not occur around the world for various reasons. And so the first, and I think most sort of time-honored theory that we have for why protest happens is this idea of relative deprivation, or the idea that people might get together and discover that they have a shared grievance, or there's a thing that's happening that they can collectively recognize is a problem. And so you can think back to union activities in the United States, huge strikes early in the 20th century, for example, that paralyzed the country and threatened the power of sort of massive railroad tycoons, for example, where sort of workers got together and realized, hey, we have a shared grievance here where we're not getting treated fairly on the railroads or in mines or that kind of thing. But beyond that, right, beyond grievances, we can think about both psychological and social reasons why protest does or doesn't happen. Another one is to think about people's sense of efficacy. So, I think it's especially important to consider protest waves from a comparative perspective or a cross-national perspective, because you think about some countries that might have, for example, highly authoritarian regimes. Authoritarian regimes where protest or demonstration against the incumbent government can be met with intense crackdowns. And in some of those places, you might think that people have very little efficacy. By which I mean they might not believe that their protest action is likely to succeed or to have much of an effect on their daily lives. Whereas in another context, efficacy might be high, where we might think, oh, if we all get together and protest, we might actually be able to win something for ourselves, and we might get our point across to the relevant authorities. And so this might be another important reason why protest does or does not occur. Of course, it goes without saying, I think I'll just be brief with these two. One other thing that is important here is that we need to be able to identify ourselves as a group. We need to know that we have some kind of collective identity, shared identity, that makes it important or salient for us to express a grievance. And so group identities are very important here. We need to be able to say, we are all in this together, and therefore we're protesting as one, not as a diverse group of fragmented individuals. We're all here to do this because we live in one city. You think about the Hong Kong protests as people identify very strongly as Hong Kongese versus mainland Chinese. Think about other protests, in the United States, for example, where some, ethnic and religious and cultural identities become salient as grounds for protest. And I think along with that, a lot of people might find that they have an emotional investment in a conflict between sort of a group of protesters and the relevant authorities, meaning that you might also have others who are not directly identifying as the group, but rather are sort of supporters of the group coming out also to engage in protest. But I think really the most important one to think about here is the theory of social embeddedness. That the political scientists have thought about as important for predicting whether or not you protest. Social embeddedness is really about getting together in a meaningful way to communicate as a group. So I think the most salient example that I can come up with for this is really in the 1960s, especially 1950s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. And so the civil rights movement, obviously, in the United States, is one that relies very heavily on a communication network that is based largely in the Black church. And so, the Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was a religious leader as well as he was a civil rights leader. And one of the reasons why many of his events and sort of the part of that movement was so successful was that he was able to mobilize the Black church as a way to communicate, to anticipate, and to ultimately build support for protest waves and demonstrations. And so ultimately, the civil rights movement, we see the Million Man March. We see events in Alabama. Culminating in very, very large protest waves indeed. And part of that is because of the social embeddedness of the movement itself within an institution that allows for the sharing of information and the sort of collaboration of resources. So all these things might together help us to understand when and why protest waves do happen, and sometimes when they don't. Now, I want to also think about another case here that I think is quite interesting. And this is one that's pointed out to us in a famous paper by political scientist Suzanne Lohmann in 1994. So Professor Lohmann studies the Monday demonstrations in East Germany and Leipzig in 1989 all the way through 91. And in this particular set of examples in Leipzig, obviously East Germany was under sort of increasingly intense kind of lockdown from Soviet forces who were concerned, rightly as it turned out, about the breakdown of the Soviet Union. And there were sort of pro-reunification protesters that came out on Mondays, and they would walk around this sort of famous town square in Leipzig silently, very peacefully, in support of unification against, potentially some serious concerns, right? Some threats of repression. And Professor Lohmann really asked this question. She wants to know, why is it that people sometimes didn't turn out very much in the Leipzig demonstrations, and sometimes lots of people turned out? What was going on here? How can we understand what explains the amount of turnout in these demonstrations? And so, as it turns out, if we can think about all these different reasons why protest waves occur, really it was within this social embeddedness idea. It was information, ultimately, that was most important in predicting turnout in the Monday demonstrations. And so the idea was, and I'll show you here a table that's reproduced from this article. Basically, you can see that, you can even just look at the size of these numbers, the number of digits of the numbers is kind of a little bell curve here, right? Turnout in these demonstrations around September of 1989 started to really take off, where it went from just a few hundred to 1,000 people turning out, or you can look at average turnout in each demonstration here in the hundreds, all the way up in November to over 130,000 people per demonstration in November of 1989. And so what explains this massive burst and ultimately this decline, though not nearly as steep a decline as the beginning, in the protest size? And so Professor Lohmann pinpoints here a moment when, especially in this early wave, a lot of regular, ordinary Leipzig residents started to identify, hey, wait a minute, if we participate in these demonstrations, it doesn't look like we're being cracked down on. It doesn't look like, the secret police are coming in to intervene. And so that made it feel a lot safer for people to come out and have their voices heard. And ultimately that resulted in this huge proliferation of the turnout itself. Now, I really like this as a way to think about where we are today, because remember, in 1989, this would have been a word-of-mouth kind of communication. This would have been people literally opening their blinds, peeking out of their blinds, seeing the silent protesters walking around the square, and then later, in maybe sort of furtive conversation, telling their friends, hey, did you see the protest was bigger this week? I think maybe that other people are starting to support this more. Maybe we should support it. Maybe we could come out next time. But of course, in the present period, we don't need to have a whisper network like that. We can have communications online. We can text our friends. We can say, hey, did you see how big the demonstration was yesterday? I heard there's going to be another one next week. What if we went too? And so this kind of thing, which took months for the signal to be spread, basically, now could take seconds, could take minutes for people to be communicating to one another online about what happened and what's going to happen. And so I really like this quote from Bruce Bimber, who really kind of summarizes this idea. People make the decision to act because they become aware that others are doing so. And so we might be averse to coming out and protesting and being the first person there. You never want to be the first person to a party, right? You want to arrive fashionably late when the party's in full swing. It's a lot more risky for us to come to a small thing where we're an individual and we can be targeted and pointed out. But when we arrive and there's a throng of people that's so large that we become one of a large number, then it becomes less personally risky to ourselves to engage in this kind of extra electoral political behavior. And so I want to think about this from the perspective of political communication theory, and I want you to think about this as we get ready for class this week. And so I've got a list here. We can add, of course, many additional social movements and protest waves that have occurred in the meantime. So, for example, one recent case that I think is quite important is in Myanmar or in Burma, where there's a very sort of bloody crackdown or repression of a social movement happening there right now. And we can think about all the way back from the Arab Spring starting in 2010, and certainly the Lim article from this week's reading is going to talk a lot about that, all the way to Occupy Wall Street, the sort of taking of Zuccotti Park, and the sort of anti-capitalist demonstrations that happened there, kind of echoing some earlier demonstrations against the WTO in various places. Obviously, the most important case probably that we'll talk about is the Black Lives Matter movement, which is happening ongoing in America today and produced some of the largest demonstrations that we've ever seen over the last couple of years. Actually, Candlelight Revolution, Women's March, I think that's a pretty important and interesting case where it was literally so large as a demonstration in Washington, D.C. that it ended up being unable to march because it had occupied the entire public space, essentially, in the Capitol District. And then we can look at, cross-nationally at a variety of different protest waves, including, I think, Hong Kong, obviously, is a very important and relevant one that we'll talk about. But in all of these, I want us to ask some critical questions about media and politics, and media as a source of power of these protest waves, and potentially, as we'll see in some of the other reading, as a deterrent to these protest waves. And so we can ask ourselves, I think, a pivotal question: is social media necessary for these protest waves to succeed? And how have technologies been used in recent times to push back against protest waves like these? So I really look forward to our discussion. I think this is going to be an interesting setup. I hope you keep some of these cases and other cases that you may be able to think about in mind as we engage in this discussion. I hope that this is a stimulating topic that we will touch on in our very last substantive course meeting for the semester. So that being said, I hope that you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to getting into it. See you soon.